The sun was high on that late spring morning in 2008, when Emily Watson guided her 3-year-old son James through the crowded gates of the city zoo, her heart lightened by the sound of his giggles as he pointed out balloons, colorful maps, and the chatter of children rushing ahead with their parents. She carried a small backpack filled with juice boxes and peanut butter crackers, feeling for once like she could give him a day untouched by the heaviness of bills and her husband's long work shifts. James, with his mop of brown curls and wide, curious eyes, darted toward the reptile house with the fearless energy of a child who trusted the world would always catch him. Emily called after him, gripping his little hand whenever the crowd thickened, but the sheer number of people pressing around them made her pulse race. The smell of popcorn mixed with the damp, earthy scent that wafted from the enclosures, creating a strange backdrop for what would soon be seared into her memory forever. Near the glass wall of the reptile house, where children pressed their palms flat against the smudged surface to watch the ancient shapes of crocodiles drift beneath the murky water, James squirmed from her grasp. It happened in an instant, like trying to hold water in her fingers. His small hand slipped away, and he was gone, swallowed by the press of families and strollers and voices rising like a storm. Emily's heart leapt to her throat as she spun, calling his name again and again, her voice drowned out by the constant drone of chatter and laughter. Panic cracked through her composure as she pushed between strangers, her breath coming sharp and ragged, the backpack slipping from her shoulder as she clawed through the crowd. She imagined him crouched by the glass, or toddling toward the snack bar, but each turn revealed only strangers' faces and children who were not hers. Within minutes that stretched into eternities, zoo officials were alerted, their radios crackling with urgency as the order to seal the gates rang out. Families clustered together, some pulling their children closer, others stepping aside as uniformed staff began sweeping each path and exhibit with growing intensity. Emily's pleas echoed against the metal and concrete, each unanswered call chipping at her sanity until she felt like she might collapse under the weight of fear. Hours bled together under the relentless sun, and when twilight finally cast long shadows across the reptile house, James had not been found. Emily's knees buckled as police lights flickered across the zoo walls, a cruel reminder that the world she knew had been shattered in the span of a single vanished moment, leaving only a hollow ache where her son's laughter had been. The moment James's absence was confirmed, the zoo transformed from a place of wonder into a cage of dread, and officials wasted no time ordering the gates locked, sealing every family and stranger inside with the weight of unspoken fear pressing against the humid air. Parents clutched their children tighter, some whispering prayers while others tried to soothe restless little ones. But Emily Watson was beyond composure as her voice rose above the growing murmur, her cries for James echoing across the paved walkways and through the echoing chambers of the reptile house. Police officers in dark uniforms rushed through the crowd, their radios buzzing with clipped commands, splitting into teams that combed every enclosure, restroom, and food court, their faces grim with the urgency of time slipping away. Zookeepers moved with them, keys jangling as they opened staff doors and restricted pathways, searching behind cages and under service corridors where a frightened child might wander. Each sweep came up empty, leaving Emily to collapse against the iron railing near the crocodile enclosure, her chest heaving with sobs that drew sympathetic glances yet no comfort, because no one could give her the one thing she needed. Hours bled into each other under the relentless sun, as visitors who had once been excited for cotton candy and carousel rides now stood stranded, held by police tape and unanswered questions, their voices subdued into uneasy whispers. Officers questioned parents, their children, even concession workers, gathering fragments of stories, but none held the thread that could unravel James's disappearance. The scent of fried food hung heavy and sickly sweet in the thickening evening air, clashing with the stench of the animal pens, while the flashing lights of patrol cars stationed outside threw eerie colors against the zoo's outer walls, a cruel carnival glow marking the gravity of the crisis. Emily paced with wild eyes, her hands trembling as she begged each uniformed figure for news, her desperation sharp as broken glass, her pleas cracking the stillness of those long waiting hours. Shadows stretched across the pathways as daylight drained, and with each passing minute, the crowd's restlessness deepened into unease, a shared dread that something unthinkable had already happened. Emily, once a mother planning only to end the day with sticky fingers and tired smiles, now found herself trapped in a waking nightmare. Her son's laughter replaced by silence, her world locked down just like the gates that barred every exit, as though the zoo itself had conspired to keep the truth hidden inside its walls. As the search dragged on through that endless night, whispers began to curl through the zoo like smoke, drifting from staff to officers to frightened parents, all of them desperate for some explanation, some thread to follow that might make sense of a child vanishing in plain sight. And the name that rose most often was Alan Pierce, the longtime crocodile keeper whose gruff silence and solitary habits had always set him apart. Some swore they had seen him lingering near the enclosure at the precise hour James disappeared, his khaki uniform damp with sweat and his eyes darting in ways that suggested unease, while others muttered about old grievances with management that left him bitter and unpredictable. The police questioned him under the stark glare of portable floodlights set up near the reptile house, his face pale and jaw tight as he denied any involvement, insisting he had only been tending to the water pumps when the chaos erupted. Emily stood only yards away, her heart hammering against her ribs as she watched his lips move, straining to hear anything that might reveal the truth, her mind latching on to every rumor like a drowning woman grasping for driftwood. But suspicion, sharp as it was, yielded nothing concrete, only the aching vacuum of unanswered questions. Alan's record showed no history of wrongdoing. His co-workers grudgingly admitted that he knew the crocodiles better than anyone, and with no physical evidence, the case slid into that cruel space where doubt is all that remains yet cannot be acted upon. Still, Emily could not shake the way his eyes flickered toward her when he was released, the fleeting glance that felt loaded with something unspoken, and in the long years that followed, whenever she closed her eyes to pray for James, his face would rise unbidden, a specter of what might have been. The zoo itself carried the weight of that suspicion like a hidden scar, its walkways filled with uneasy glances from parents who remembered the headlines and avoided the reptile house altogether, while Alan continued his work behind the fences, feeding the beasts in silence, his presence tolerated, but never fully trusted. For Emily, every whisper about him was both a torment and a lifeline, for suspicion meant there was still a possibility that James had not simply slipped into the jaws of fate, but into the hands of someone who had chosen silence over truth. And that sliver of doubt, poisonous and persistent, clung to her as the years wore on, leaving her stranded between hope and horror. Weeks bled into months, and the search for James shifted from frantic urgency to a hollow silence that wrapped itself around Emily's life like a shroud, leaving her with nothing but the echo of questions that never found answers. At first, she woke each morning clinging to the hope that perhaps the phone would ring with news, perhaps a tip would surface, perhaps someone had seen a boy who matched her son's face in a crowd somewhere far away. But as the days stretched into seasons, that hope soured into something jagged and poisonous, a guilt that gnawed at her until she could scarcely breathe. She replayed the moment in the reptile house endlessly, tormenting herself with the thought that if she had held his hand tighter, if she had not paused to look at the map, if she had not allowed herself 1 second of distraction, James would still be there to climb into her lap at night. Her husband tried at first to be her anchor, bringing tea to her side when she could not rise from bed, urging her to eat when she ignored the plates of food. But grief has a way of turning lovers into strangers, and soon his eyes carried resentment more than sympathy. His silence growing heavier each night he stayed out later. Arguments cracked through the walls of their home, blame spilling in both directions until the foundation of their marriage crumbled under the unbearable weight of loss. The police, after combing every lead and interrogating every shadow, declared the case cold. The file closed with words that felt like a betrayal carved in stone, but Emily refused to accept that her son had been erased from the world without a trace. She filled her small house with photos of James, his smiling face taped to mirrors, refrigerator doors, even her bedside lamp, each image a defiance against the void. Friends drifted away, uneasy in the presence of grief that refused to soften, until she was left alone with her obsessions, poring over old news clippings and retracing her steps at the zoo like a pilgrim visiting a ruined shrine. At night, when sleep would not come, she whispered to the darkness that she knew James was alive, somewhere that a mother's heart would not keep beating if her child's had already stilled. This belief, fragile and desperate, was the only thing that kept her moving forward as the years pressed on like an endless tide. Every year, when the calendar crept toward late spring, Emily felt the same heaviness settle over her, as if the very air thickened with memory, and on the anniversary of James's disappearance, she returned to the city zoo, carrying a bouquet of fresh flowers cradled against her chest like a fragile offering. The gates always looked different, yet somehow the same, repainted or repaired in places but still standing as a barrier between her and the moment her life had splintered, and she would walk through them with slow, deliberate steps, her heart pounding in rhythm with the crunch of gravel beneath her shoes. The crowds around her rarely noticed the grief etched into her face, tourists laughing and children squealing as though this place held nothing but joy. But for Emily, every path was marked, every bench remembered, every railing a witness to that day in 2008 when James vanished into shadows. She made her way without fail to the reptile house gates, pausing to rest her hand on the cold iron before laying the flowers down carefully. Always choosing bright colors that James had loved, yellows and blues and soft whites. A splash of innocence against the rusted bars. Some years she whispered his name aloud, her voice trembling like a prayer carried away by the wind. Other years she stood in silence, staring into the murky water beyond the glass, where crocodiles drifted like living relics, her mind a storm of what-ifs that never ceased. People stared sometimes, wondering at the woman who wept quietly at the exhibit, but most walked past, and Emily preferred it that way, her grief too raw to share with strangers. These visits became ritual, the one constant in a life unraveling, and though they never brought her answers, they renewed a determination she could not abandon, a vow to James that she would not let him fade into the forgotten files of the police archives. Each time she left the zoo, her steps heavier than when she entered, she told herself she would keep searching, keep asking questions, keep pressing against the silence even when the world urged her to accept and move on. In those flowers at the gates lay both her sorrow and her defiance, a mother's declaration that love does not end where hope falters. And though the years stretched longer, the ritual bound her to James, reminding her that the truth still waited somewhere in the shadows. In the spring of 2015, 7 long years after James had vanished, Emily returned once more to the zoo with flowers in her trembling hands, her routine etched into her bones like the grooves of a well-worn path. But on that particular visit, something shifted when a man with thinning white hair and stooped shoulders lingered near the reptile house and quietly spoke her name. She turned, startled, to find Harold Miller, a retired zoo worker she barely recognized from the earliest days after the tragedy. His eyes shadowed by the weight of secrets he had carried too long. In a voice low enough that the crowd would not hear, he told her there had once been security footage, grainy recordings from the cameras mounted outside the crocodile enclosure, and in those images James could be seen, small and alive, near the railings in the minutes before chaos erupted. Emily's heart stopped, the world narrowing to the rasp of his words, and she demanded to know why she had never been shown such evidence, why no officer had ever mentioned its existence. Harold's hands shook as he explained that the tapes had been collected and logged, but when the investigation pressed forward, they were reported as damaged, corrupted beyond recovery, a claim he never believed because he had glimpsed the images himself before they disappeared into an evidence room he could no longer access. He leaned closer, confessing that whispers among the staff suggested the recordings were deliberately erased, that someone with power feared liability or scandal and ensured they would never see the light of day. Emily felt her knees weaken as she imagined those lost frames, James's small figure frozen in black and white, perhaps the last proof that he had not simply vanished into thin air, and rage sparked inside her, a wildfire that threatened to consume her grief. She pressed Harold for details, but he only shook his head, saying he had come forward now because age had stripped him of fear and guilt had left him sleepless. But even so, he had no proof, only memory. Before slipping back into the crowd, he warned her to be careful, that digging too deeply might uncover things the zoo or others wished to remain buried. Emily stood motionless at the gates, the flowers trembling in her grip, her heart hammering with a renewed conviction that the truth had been stolen from her, and that she could not allow silence to be James's only legacy. By the summer of 2015, the whispered warning about the missing footage gnawed at Emily until she could no longer sit in silence, and her restless search eventually brought her back to the name that had haunted her since the beginning. Alan Pierce, the crocodile keeper, whose presence had lingered like a shadow over every unanswered question. She learned he had left the zoo years earlier and now lived on the edge of town in a weathered trailer tucked behind an overgrown lot. His life reduced to isolation and suspicion that never quite let go of him. Emily arrived one overcast afternoon, her heart pounding as she knocked on the dented metal door, the sound echoing through the stillness until he appeared, older and gaunter than she remembered, his eyes sunken yet sharp with a wariness that told her he had expected this confrontation one day. Their exchange was brittle from the first words. Emily demanding to know what had happened to James, Alan insisting again and again that he knew nothing beyond the chaos of that day, his voice rising with frustration but faltering when she pressed harder. His denials cracked when he muttered something about James's little red jumper, a detail never released to the press, and one Emily had never shared publicly. And her breath caught as she realized the enormity of his slip. She fixed her gaze on him, her voice low but trembling as she asked how he could possibly know, and for a flicker of a moment his eyes widened before narrowing again, his mouth tightening as he backtracked, claiming he had heard it from rumors or police chatter. Emily felt anger course through her veins like fire, the certainty growing that he had seen more than he ever admitted, that the truth lay buried beneath years of silence and fear. The encounter ended with Alan slamming the door in her face, leaving her standing in the fading light with her heart racing, the echo of his mistake reverberating in her mind. As she walked away, the weight of his words settled on her like a stone, heavier than grief, heavier than hope. For now she carried proof that someone had held a piece of James's story all along and chosen to bury it. Though she trembled with rage and despair, she also felt a strange clarity, as if fate had handed her a thread at last, one that she could follow no matter where it led, even if the truth, waiting at the end, destroyed her completely. In the spring of 2020, when the world was distracted by chaos of its own, Emily's heart lurched at the headline that appeared quietly in the local paper. announcing that the zoo's crocodiles were to be relocated after a string of unexplained deaths inside the enclosure that had haunted her for more than a decade. To most readers, it was a footnote, an oddity about sick animals that drew no more than passing interest. But to Emily, it was like a key turning inside a locked door, reopening every suspicion she had buried and forcing her to stare once more at the darkness she could never escape. She clipped the article and read it again and again, her fingers trembling over the faded photo of the pit where water lay still and green, remembering how James had slipped from her hand within sight of that very place, how his laughter had vanished into silence as if swallowed by the ancient creatures that had lurked beneath the surface. Officials offered explanations, blaming contamination, age, and breeding problems, but Emily knew instinctively that the deaths were more than coincidence, that the timing itself was a cruel reminder she could not ignore. She walked the perimeter of the zoo days later, staring through the mesh at the diminished movement within the enclosure, her reflection wavering against the glass as she searched the shadows for meaning. Other parents strolled by, their children perched on shoulders, pointing at the crocodiles with curiosity. But Emily stood apart, her presence heavy with memories that few could comprehend, her grief still raw despite the passage of years. The thought burrowed deeper into her mind that if something unnatural had been hidden within the water all these years, perhaps these deaths were not random, but the result of something long suppressed finally surfacing. She spoke of her suspicions to no one at first, aware of how quickly she had been dismissed in the past, yet the knowledge pressed against her chest like a weight she could not put down. Each night, she replayed the words of Harold Miller, the retired worker, and the slip made by Alan Pierce, piecing them together until the pattern emerged so stark she could not ignore it. She became convinced the enclosure itself was a tomb that kept secrets, that James's fate was somehow bound to the creatures whose deaths now commanded headlines. And though her heart ached at the possibility, she knew she would not rest until the truth beneath the water was finally revealed. The day the zoo announced the crocodiles had been successfully relocated and the pit would be drained for cleaning, Emily stood among the small crowd of curious onlookers, her body trembling with a tension that felt both unbearable and inevitable, as if she had been holding her breath for 12 endless years and was only now exhaling. Workers in bright vests and heavy boots clambered down the cracked concrete steps into the drained enclosure, their movements slow and deliberate as pumps groaned and spat out the last of the murky green water that had long obscured the pit's secrets. The smell was sharp and sour, a mix of stagnant water and decay, and it wafted upward to the silent gathering above. Emily clutched the railing, her knuckles white, her eyes locked on the dark silt at the bottom where shovels began to scrape and dig. She had told herself she would not look, that she had endured too much already, but her gaze refused to turn away, as if her soul knew what her mind was too afraid to name. Then came the call, sharp and startled, a worker's voice breaking the heavy stillness as he crouched and brushed away clumps of thick sludge, his gloved hands unearthing something pale and brittle against the blackened ground. Another worker joined him, and together they uncovered the unmistakable shape of skeletal remains, small and heartbreakingly fragile, the kind of bones that had no place in the bottom of a crocodile enclosure. Gasps rippled through the crowd, some turning away while others pressed closer, the air filled with a horrified disbelief. Emily's breath caught in her throat as her eyes focused on the fabric tangled around the bones, faded and rotted but still recognizable, fragments of a toddler's red jumper that time had not managed to erase. Her knees buckled and she gripped the railing to steady herself, a sob tearing from her chest, for in that moment the years of desperate searching collapsed into a single cruel truth lying in the mud. Officers rushed to cordon off the area, their radios crackling with urgent codes, but Emily could hear none of it. Her world narrowed to the sight below, the certainty that this pit had cradled her son's silence all along. As she stood there, her tears falling hot against her cheeks, she realized the nightmare she had replayed countless times had finally revealed its ending. Not in hope, but in bones and cloth, a finality that left no room for denial. When the call finally came from the coroner's office, Emily felt as though the world tilted beneath her feet, the sterile voice on the other end confirming that DNA testing had matched the skeletal remains found in the drained enclosure to her son, James Watson. The boy who had vanished from her grasp in 2008 and whose absence had carved a wound so deep she had almost forgotten what it felt like to breathe without pain. She listened in silence as the officials spoke of percentages and markers, the language of science stripping the news of tenderness. But to her it was not numbers. It was the cruel final blow to hope that had kept her walking through every unbearable year. For 12 years she had allowed herself to believe that perhaps James had been taken, that perhaps he was alive somewhere beyond her reach, that maybe one day he would walk through her door or call her name. But now there was no denying that his tiny bones had been swallowed by the pit, hidden in silence beneath the water, where crocodiles drifted like ancient guardians of a secret too dark to surface. Her sobs came in heaving waves, crashing through her chest until she collapsed against the kitchen counter, the phone slipping from her trembling hand. Yet amid the devastation, a new flame of anger lit inside her, for the confirmation was not simply an ending but also a beginning, the spark that forced the authorities to reopen the case with the grim possibility that negligence or deliberate concealment had led to James's death. Questions that had once been dismissed as a grieving mother's obsession now carried weight. The erased tapes, the slip from Alan Pierce, the silence of the zoo officials, all threads weaving into a pattern too sinister to ignore. Reporters gathered outside her home when the news broke, their cameras flashing as if tragedy were spectacle. But Emily shut the door on them. Her focus narrowed on the image of James's red jumper recovered from the mud, a shroud of truth that demanded justice. Though grief pressed on her with suffocating force, she clung to the knowledge that her voice, silenced too often, would finally be heard, that her son's story would not be reduced to a line in a forgotten report. The confirmation shattered her, but it also steeled her, binding her to the pursuit of answers, no matter how deep the lies had been buried. The reopening of the case pushed detectives back into the tangled threads of 2008. And soon the focus shifted to the security system that had supposedly failed on the day James disappeared, a failure long dismissed as technical error, but now examined with sharper eyes. Technicians recovered old maintenance logs, brittle with time, and pieced together fragments that revealed the cameras had been fully operational that morning, recording clearly until the very hour James slipped from Emily's grasp. Then, without warning, entire blocks of data vanished, not corrupted as once claimed, but deliberately erased, overwritten by someone with access to the system's controls. The discovery rippled through the department like a jolt of electricity, igniting fury and shame that such a detail had been overlooked for so many years, and suspicion once more circled back to Alan Pierce, the crocodile keeper who had already revealed too much in his careless slip about James's red jumper. Investigators pored over records of who held keys, who logged into the system, who had the authority to erase files, and Alan's name appeared again, tied to late-night access and unexplained log entries in the weeks after the disappearance. For Emily, the revelation was both vindication and torment, proof that she had not been imagining the shadows that clung to the story, but also confirmation that someone had stolen from her the chance to know the truth when it mattered most. She remembered the way Alan's eyes had flickered during their confrontation, the nervous edge in his denial, and now it all returned like a haunting chorus, louder and more insistent. The zoo released statements denying knowledge, claiming poor oversight. But the public began to murmur about cover-ups and negligence, about the ease with which a child had vanished in a place meant to protect families. Emily stood outside the reptile house once more, staring at the emptied pit where James's bones had been found, her reflection in the glass warped and broken, and she felt the rage swell inside her, like a tide against a crumbling shore. The missing footage was no longer just a technical footnote. It was the cruel hand that had forced her to live 12 years in torment, and she vowed silently that the truth would not be allowed to sink again into silence. Every erased frame was an accusation, and she would see it answered. Alan Pierce's name had hung over the case like a storm cloud for more than a decade, and when detectives finally tracked him down in the winter of 2021, he was a man withered by sickness, his once broad frame reduced to fragile bones beneath thin skin, his breath ragged as though each word cost him more than he could spare. Emily was not allowed in the interrogation room, but she waited just outside the frosted glass, her heart pounding as muffled voices carried through, the sound of his coughs punctuating every sentence. At first he denied, as he always had, clinging to the story that he knew nothing, but the walls around him had thinned, and under the weight of evidence and his own failing body, he finally broke, the words spilling out in halting fragments that pieced together the nightmare Emily had imagined in her darkest hours. He admitted he had seen James that day, the boy's small frame climbing the low barrier that had separated visitors from the crocodile pit, a barrier Alan himself had warned management was inadequate, though no one listened. He said he froze, watching in horror as the child lost his balance and tumbled forward, his tiny body vanishing into the water with barely a splash, the creatures below stirring in sudden frenzy. Alan's face, pale and drawn, twisted with remembered fear as he described the moment, and his voice cracked as he confessed he had run. Not to save James, but to erase what he had seen, terrified of losing his job, terrified of the blame that would surely fall on him for negligence. He admitted he had slipped into the security office and destroyed the tapes, deliberately wiping the images that showed the truth, leaving behind only confusion and the cruel illusion of abduction. Emily pressed her hand against the glass, her body trembling with a storm of rage and despair, her tears burning hot trails down her face as she realized he had condemned her to 12 years of torment with his silence. Alan lowered his head as the detectives pressed him, his voice little more than a whisper as he begged for forgiveness he would never earn, confessing that every night he had seen James's face in his dreams, a reminder of the life stolen not only by tragedy but by cowardice. For Emily, the confession was both a blade and a balm, the truth at last but wrapped in betrayal so deep it hollowed her all over again. The inquiry was held in a crowded municipal hall in the autumn of 2021, its walls lined with photographs of city officials and a scattering of microphones that crackled under the weight of voices demanding answers. And when Alan Pierce's written confession was read aloud, the room shifted from murmurs to stunned silence, each word striking like a hammer on stone. Emily sat in the front row, her hands clenched tightly in her lap, her eyes fixed on the frail figure of Alan seated only a few feet away, his body bent by illness, his once imposing presence diminished to little more than a shadow of the man who had carried secrets for 12 agonizing years. His words were delivered in the flat monotone of an official, yet Emily heard them as if James himself had whispered them back to her across the years, the description of the low barrier, the sight of her little boy slipping forward, the splash that signaled the end of innocence, and then the cowardice of a man who had chosen silence over truth. Rage welled up inside her like fire, threatening to consume her entirely, but layered beneath it was sorrow so deep it left her gasping, the crushing reality that James's final moments had been witnessed and concealed, that she had been left to wander through grief like a blind woman in the dark, while the truth had always been within reach. The inquiry board shifted uncomfortably, their faces pale, some jotting notes, as if bureaucracy could ever soften the blow of a mother's torment, and members of the public, parents and strangers alike, leaned forward with tears in their eyes, shaken by the callousness of what had been hidden. Alan lifted his gaze briefly, his eyes finding Emily's, and for a fleeting instant they locked, the weight of 12 years pressing between them, and she saw not the keeper of crocodiles but the keeper of silence, a man broken by guilt yet unworthy of forgiveness. She wanted to scream, to demand why, but her voice failed, caught between fury and despair, leaving her only the hollow comfort of knowing the uncertainty had been stripped away at last. The truth, though late and bitter, had been spoken into the open air, and though it did not return James to her arms, it cut through the fog that had suffocated her since 2008, offering her not peace but clarity, a cruel gift that was both unbearable and undeniable. By the spring of 2022, after months of hearings, headlines, and the slow machinery of accountability grinding its way through the city, the zoo finally unveiled a modest memorial at the edge of the reptile house, a simple bronze plaque mounted on a stone base that bore James Watson's name and the dates that marked both his beginning and his end. Crowds gathered quietly on the morning of its dedication, their voices hushed as though the place demanded reverence now, no longer merely an exhibit but a site of sorrow sanctified by loss. Emily stood at the front, her hands trembling as she clutched the small stuffed giraffe James had carried with him everywhere. The toy faded now, its seams frayed from years of being held through sleepless nights and long vigils where hope refused to die. She pressed it against her chest as the mayor spoke words about community and healing, but they drifted past her like distant echoes, for all she could see was the shimmer of sunlight glinting against the plaque, the letters of her son's name carved in permanence where once there had been only silence. When the cloth was pulled away and the crowd bowed their heads, Emily felt tears stream freely down her cheeks, not just the raw grief of a mother who had lost her child, but also the release of carrying that grief alone for so long, finally acknowledged, finally given a place in the world beyond her memory. Children who had come to see the animals clung to their parents' hands as they passed by, some pausing to look at the flowers and small toys already being placed at the base of the memorial, their innocent curiosity both piercing and tender. Emily knelt slowly, her knees pressing into the earth, and placed the stuffed giraffe beside the plaque, her fingers lingering on its worn fabric before she let it go, as though laying down a piece of herself that had been trapped in 2008. The moment was not peace, not the absolution she had long prayed for, but it was something she could hold, a recognition that James's life had mattered, that his absence had carved an indelible mark, not just on her, but on the place that had failed to protect him. As she rose, wiping her tears, the spring breeze carried the scent of blossoms from nearby trees, and for the first time in years, Emily felt the faintest glimmer that grief and love could coexist without crushing her completely. The crowd had thinned by late afternoon, leaving only the rustle of leaves and the faint calls of distant animals as Emily stood alone before the plaque that now bore her son's name, the bronze catching the fading sunlight in a glow that seemed both holy and unbearable. She reached out, her fingertips brushing the cool surface, as though by touching the letters she might bridge the 12 years of silence that had swallowed James from her arms. And for the first time she allowed herself to whisper goodbye, her voice breaking into the quiet air, fragile yet certain. The words tasted foreign on her tongue, like a language she had resisted learning, but once spoken they carried a strange weight that lifted something inside her chest, as if grief itself had been waiting for permission to loosen its grip. Tears spilled freely, streaking her cheeks in rivers she did not try to hide, and she let them come, not fighting the sorrow but welcoming it. For now it was no longer confusion or suspicion, no longer the endless torment of not knowing, but the clean, sharp ache of truth. Around her, the zoo seemed eerily still, its laughter and chatter from earlier hours replaced by a hush that felt almost reverent, as though even the animals understood the sanctity of her moment. She thought of the years she had walked these paths in shadow, leaving flowers at locked gates, begging the air for answers that never came, and how each visit had been a wound reopened, a ritual of defiance against the silence that mocked her. Now, though her heart remained shattered, there was a strange strength threading through the pieces, the knowledge that the silence was broken, that James's story was not erased, but carved here in bronze where the world could see and remember. She leaned down once more to straighten the stuffed giraffe at the base, its faded fabric fluttering in the breeze, and pressed her lips against its worn ear before stepping back. The ache inside her was endless, but it no longer felt like drowning. It felt like carrying, heavy yet survivable. The burden of a mother who would never stop loving her child, even as life demanded she keep walking. With one last glance at the plaque, Emily turned toward the exit, her steps slow but steady, leaving the zoo not with peace, for that would never be hers, but with the strength to carry on, knowing that at last the truth had been spoken into the world.